Hi, everyone. My name is Cody Fry, and I'm going to take you through my song called I Hear a Symphony, which is off my album Flying. So, the idea for this song came to me while I was trying to figure out how to introduce more chromaticism and dissonance into like a pop song. And I thought of this idea about how, you know, when you love someone, the feeling at first is like pentatonic. Everything is like so simple, easy, and you're like, this is just the catchiest song I've ever heard. But as you go deeper in that emotion, you realize that what really makes love beautiful is all of those moments of just like unexpectedness. Which is, I think, what chromaticism is. It's like the dissonance, the tension, and the release is what makes love an amazing thing and what makes music an amazing thing. And so I thought maybe I could write a song about that and try to tie the two together musically and lyrically. So that's where the idea for I Hear a Symphony came from. So to start out, I began at the piano, basically wrote the melody and lyrics just at the piano. But from the piano, I did something different, which I don't normally do, which is I opened up my music notation software called Finale, and I began to write the score for I Hear a Symphony kind of like without programming it, which is something unusual for me. Normally I, get in and with the MIDI instruments and fiddle around. But for this, I wanted to kind of like see it vertically and horizontally with notes on a page because I knew I wanted the piece to start out as simply as a song could begin, basically just a voice. And I wanted it to end with just this bombastic orchestral interlude. So this is what that score looks like. For this orchestra session, it was a lot smaller than what you would typically see in a full-on symphony orchestra. For woodwinds, we just had flute and clarinet. We had 2 French horns, and then 2 trombones and a tuba. That was the brass. And then we just had a string section. So that was the entire orchestra, the flying orchestra. So on the score, you'll see that it's a lot, smaller than a big orchestral score would be because we just didn't have all the instruments. It's also why you won't hear any oboe on flying, that sort of thing, because we didn't have it. One interesting thing about the session is that we recorded 17 songs in 6 hours. The first 3 hours were with the whole group, and then the second 3 hours were with just strings. And we recorded everything for flying, and we also recorded a bunch of my Christmas music all in this one session. And it was such an amazing experience. It was like a bucket list thing for me. And recording an orchestra is pretty expensive, which is obviously why we didn't have the full symphony orchestra, because I couldn't afford it. But my dad came in and he conducted in the room so that I could be in the control room and listen to it without having to, wave my arms around or anything like that. And so I got to hear how it was coming across through the speakers. And it was, I don't know, it was just the best. So I'll take you through a few pages of the score. It begins, obviously, strings with mutes on, stays strings for a while. This is all still strings. And you can see here's where the modulation begins. And all of the instruments come in here. You can see it gets a lot more black on the page, a lot more notes being played. So this is what I Hear a Symphony looks like in my head when I listen to it. So from the notation, I then make a full orchestral mock-up of the whole song because when you're spending a lot of money, you want to make sure it's going to work. So I do my best to kind of like make sure that everything is working as I imagined it. And MIDI isn't perfect, but it can give you a great idea of what things are actually going to sound like. So this is the Logic file that I use to mock up the whole orchestra. I'll let you hear some of that. So these are all fake instruments. Mute the vocal and piano here. So obviously a different vibe with fake instruments. Those were actually a really old version of the Vienna Symphonic Library that I used to program everything. Now I'm on to the Spitfire audio stuff, which I just love. That's not on this track, but for all your orchestral programmers out there, all four of you, Spitfire audio, I'm obsessed. So the first thing to know about the way that we recorded this song was that we recorded the piano first by itself. So I recorded at Sound Emporium, their beautiful Yamaha grand piano, and I played the piano part with no click, just how I wanted it to be interpreted. So you'll see when I open up the tempo track here, I beat mapped the entire piano part after I recorded it. So the tempo is kind of all over the place. And the reason I did that is because I wanted it to feel really human, and I wanted on piano to be able to express the tempo in the way that I wanted to without having, this in my head the whole time. Some of this stuff made it into the final song. For example, we didn't have any percussion, so this is the final percussion right here. All of that stuff, would eventually be exported and brought into the mix file because we didn't have the money to bring in all that percussion stuff. So from that, we recorded the orchestra at Ocean Way Studios in Nashville, Ocean Way Studio A. It's this gorgeous converted sanctuary of a church has stained glass windows. It sounds unbelievable. So we crammed everybody in there and recorded the orchestra, and that's what this is. So this is, the mix prep file with all of the final instruments. So I'll take you through some of that. For all the cello players out there, this was an incredibly difficult cello part, super high. They're up in treble clef, but I just love the way the cello sounds in that register. It's so vital and there's so much vibration and it feels so tenuous. I wanted the expression of the theme to be in the cello, even though it's super high in the range, because I just love the way that it feels. Let the rest of the strings hold down the chord structure. One little orchestral thing I like to do is have the flute sort of just kind of flit above everything else. And you'll hear that on this section. Sounds kind of silly by itself, but the way that sits when it's on top of the orchestra, it just sort of gives everything sort of this bounciness that I really like. I'm a big fan of George Gershwin. I like those figures, the na 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 na, which is sort of a reference to Rhapsody in Blue, super famous piece of music, obviously. If it was good enough for George, I can borrow some of that. These are super fun to write. They're just, like 2-octave scales up and down. Just a fun technique you don't get to use too often in pop music. Let's go to the brass. So since we only had 2 French horn players, 2 trombones and a tuba, that's 5 parts. So I kind of needed them to kind of fill out the brass sound. And so what we did was a full pass of just brass. So that's all 5 brass players playing together. And then I had the horns do an overdub on top of that gives you the lead line. Very well performed, if I might add. Even though the brass strings and woodwinds were all there on the same day together, we ended up having them tracked separately because we needed the brass to play really loud. But because it was a small string section and, only 2 woodwinds, the brass was just blowing out everybody else. So we had them tracked by themselves so that we could have total control over that on the mixing end. Down here's all that original programming stuff. I like this part at the end in the strings. You could really see the violin players lean forward when they saw this coming. It's really hard, and they did a really good job. One string writing technique I use a lot is that instead of just writing half notes or whole notes and having the bass, cello, viola hold down chords, what I do is just give them some sort of ostinato that they can play that adds a lot of motion while still kind of telling you what the chord structure is. So you'll hear that in the cello and viola in this part of the song, where instead of just playing da da, they're playing dun 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 dun. And in case you don't know, there's no rehearsals for music like this the way we're making it. So this is probably the third time that they had even played this song. So all of these musicians, they just sit down and they just sight read this on the day of the session. Most of you probably know that, but it's remarkable. They're such talented people, and I just love getting to work with them. So that's I Hear a Symphony. I love talking orchestration. I love stuff like this. If you have something that you want to ask about that I didn't cover in this video, throw it in the comments. I love getting into the weeds with people and stuff like this. So yeah, thank you so much. This song, when I wrote it, I was like, this is definitely one for me that no one's going to listen to, because I was just like, who wants to listen to this like weird 3-minute song that only has verses and then has like a weird chromatic interlude? And the response has just been overwhelming and really humbling, honestly. Something that I thought was just for me turns out a lot of people have enjoyed listening to it, which was a surprise to me. So thank you so much for listening. Yeah. See you next time.